Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm Anna Marquise, and I'm the Civic Engagement Coordinator for the Equality State Policy Center. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of all Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. Shape Wyoming is ESPC's grassroots lobbyist training designed to help people across Wyoming engage with our government and learn how to be effective citizen advocates. Traditionally, Shape is held in Cheyenne, but obviously things look a little different this year. We'll be gathering here on Zoom on Mondays from 5 to 6 p.m. through March 8th, meaning that next Monday will be our final session. And we're super excited to get started. Just a quick overview of housekeeping. You're all probably Zoom experts, but a quick overview is that normally this session is in webinar format, so normally we can't see you, but today we're in meeting format, so we should see all of your beautiful faces. And so we'd ask that you mute yourself if you're not already muted, just so we can listen to the speakers. And if you have any questions at any time, please drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to them at the end. Also, if you have questions specific to a breakout group, just hold them until you're in that group, and I'm sure your leader will be happy to answer them. And if you have any tech issues at all, please just let me know in the chat by sending me a message directly, and I should be able to take care of that for you. And once again, as you see on the slide, if you don't mind renaming yourself to whatever group you're interested in joining. If you don't know which group you want to join yet, that's totally fine too. We'll have another opportunity to check out those numbers. Awesome. So now for introductions. We have Antonio Serrano, and he will be covering our criminal justice breakout room tonight. Antonio is the advocacy manager for the ACLU of Wyoming. As the advocacy manager, Antonio builds the ACLU's public education and advocacy programs through coalition building, leadership development, communication, and lobbying. He ensures that supporters of the ACLU of Wyoming have the tools, information, and opportunities to be effective advocates on issues like immigration and criminal justice reform. He's also one of our board members for ESPC. And next we have Julia Stubel, and she'll be covering our conservation breakout group. As the Wyoming Public Lands and Energy Associate for the Wilderness Society, Julia is excited to continue speaking up for the future of Wyoming's remarkable landscapes. With a decade of experience working for public lands and local communities, she brings an in-depth experience with direct advocacy, on-the-ground rural engagement organizing, and communicating Western conservation values. She's also a board member for ESPC. And next we have Tate Mullen, who will be covering education today. Tate is the Government Relations Director at the Wyoming Education Association. Raised in Casper, he received his master's degree in political science from UW, studying youth voter participation and mobilization. He worked as a policy and budget analysis for the Office of Budget and Management in Jefferson County, Colorado, where he was examining the impacts of Tabor on the county's service provision. He's also served as a policy and research analysis for the Kansas Action for Children in Topeka, Kansas, where he collaborated with state legislators and national partner organizations on policies aimed at improving the lives of children and their families. And last but not least, we have Jan Cartwright. Jan has worked with community health centers in Wyoming for almost 12 years at the Wyoming Primary Care Association. And she has served as executive director for the Primary Care Association for the past 6 years. The best part of her work, she reports, is supporting the growth of community health centers in Wyoming and integrating their work to provide quality care for the underserved. This is only possible because of strong collaborations within the Community Health Center network, regionally and nationally, the partnership with the Wyoming Office of Rural Health, and many other safety net and nonprofit allies. She's also a founding member of one of ESPC's coalitions, which is Healthy Wyoming. And we'll just jump right in. So Antonio, if you want to get started with your overview, take it away.
Right on. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for letting me be part of this. I always like to be part of SHAPE. It's always a lot of fun. Usually it's funner in person because then you get to interact with people and try and you know, mingle with the crowd and it's funner, you know what I'm saying? But we can make do this time, right? So tonight I'm going to be talking to you all about criminal justice reform, but with a focus on the death penalty in Wyoming. So a lot of people might say, like, why should I care about criminal justice reform in Wyoming? It's actually pretty simple. You know, justice for some is not justice, and that is something that will take all of us working at to change. Plus, Wyoming is always creating new laws and crimes with longer and harsher sentences that always disproportionately affect communities of color, indigenous people, and LGBTQ plus and two-spirit folks. So when I mean justice for some is generally those communities are left out and they don't get equal protection or equal treatment, and it's something that impacts more Wyomingites than people realize. Like according to the prison policy initiative, 1 in every 130 Wyoming residents is incarcerated, and 1 in every 58 is under some sort of criminal justice supervision, whether that's prison, jail, or probation or parole. You know, that's a lot of people behind bars and under supervision in Wyoming. And if every one of those people, everyone who was in prison or under supervision of the criminal justice system, like was all in one place, it would make up the 10th largest town in Wyoming. Like that's a lot of incarcerated people. That's a lot of people under the system. And something we need to all keep in mind is as that lower income people, again, people of color, LGBTQ plus, the two spirit folks, they have a higher chance of knowing someone or being a person who is part of the criminal justice system. And this is not because these communities are more dangerous and the more dangerous than white folks. It's because the criminal justice system disproportionately impacts them. You know, and that's been proven in a lot of different ways. Like according to the NAACP, although Black people make up 13.4% of the population, they make up 22% of fatal police shootings, 47% of wrongful conviction exonerations, and 35% of individuals executed by the death penalty. So we got to remember that much of the criminal justice system was built, honed, and firmly established during the Jim Crow era, during one of our most racist times in history. These are decades old systems and institutions that produce racially biased outcomes regardless of the intentions of the people who work within them. So when we say systemic racism, we're not saying everybody in the system is racist. We're saying the system itself was built on that and was is running because of that. So so which brings me to why I feel we should repeal the death penalty in Wyoming. So the ACLU of Wyoming opposes the death penalty because flat out it's racist. It denies equal protection of the laws. It's cruel and unusual punishment. It removes guarantees of due process of law. So we don't like it. The death penalty is also inconsistent with the underlying values of our democratic system, which is the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. The death penalty is often looked at as justice. You know, that's something that we all kind of have blinders to. We see it as justice. We've been taught our whole lives that the death penalty is justice, but really it's just murder done by the state. That's all it is, plain and simple. And the death penalty, like every other part of the criminal justice system, disproportionately affects those communities of colors and needs to be repealed now. And the way we know this death penalty is racist is because of things like in California, Latinos are murdered at twice the rate of white people, but 11 of the 13 people executed in the state were convicted of killing white people. Nationally, Latinos are murdered at twice the rate of white folks, but make up less than 7% of the victims in pending death penalty cases. So even it doesn't even bring us justice, and at least in my community. In 96% of states where there have been reviews of race and death penalty, there has always been a pattern of either race of victim or the race of defendant discrimination, or both. In places like Washington State, jurors are 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a Black defendant than they would for a white defendant in the exact same case. In Louisiana, the odds of the death sentence were 97% higher for those whose victim was a white person than for those whose victim was a Black person. So that shows that it doesn't even bring justice to communities of color. It only brings harm. Um, and on top of that, you know, with everything going on being talked about with Wyoming's budget, the death penalty is extremely, extremely expensive to maintain. And we know this because in places, so many other places, like I named before, you know, in Oklahoma, where capital cases cost an average of 3.2 times more than non-capital cases. In Kansas, they average 400,000 per case compared to 100,000 per case when the death penalty is not seeked. In California, the cost of the death penalty in the state has been over 4 billion since 1978. In Florida, 24 million for each execution. That's an expensive thing right there. In Texas, the death penalty costs an average of 2.3 million. And in Wyoming, we spend $61,000 annually to house death row inmates, and just because of increased security costs and things it takes to keep them in that category. And in death row inmates, they spend an average of 20 to 30 years on death row. So that's just a crazy cost that we don't need to be taking on. So, I mean, why would we want to continue to funding an inhumane, a racist system when it provides no public safety benefit? By repealing the death penalty, Wyoming could save millions and hopefully put that money towards something we really need here in Wyoming, like education, mental health services. There's so many other things that we really desperately need here. So, plain and simple, what Wyoming can do to bring some positive reforms to our criminal justice system is it's going to be on people like us, everyday people, advocates, community folks, pushing, raising our voices, pushing lawmakers to pass probation and parole reform legislation. It's going to be us pushing lawmakers to direct the Department of Corrections to establish a women's boot camp program. It's going to be us pushing lawmakers to conduct an interim study on low-level misdemeanors and felonies, in addition to examining state mandatory sentencing. So this is going to, and then the last one but not least, it's going to be up to us to ask our legislature to vote yes on Senate File 150 and repeal the death penalty in Wyoming finally, once and for all. So that's just I mean, like, the criminal justice system is so in depth. That's the tip of the iceberg, man. There's so many other different things that it's connected to, like the school system, even like it's immense, and it's too much to cover in just a short few minutes. But people who want to join my breakout room, we're going to be taking action tonight on the death penalty. And then we're going to be learning about some actions that are coming up in the next few days where you can take action and you can help push lawmakers to try and get rid of this death penalty for all. So thank you. That was my talk about criminal justice reform, and I look forward to seeing folks in my breakout room.
Awesome. And just as another reminder, Antonio's room is going to be number 1. So if you're interested in joining that group, make sure to rename yourself and put a 1 in front of your name. And awesome. Let's hear from Julia for conservation.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Antonio. I have to say, I kind of want to join your breakout room now, but I will honor my obligation. I'll hold my own. We will be discussing in group number 2, the large conversation about conservation. We're going to narrow it down into a still sizable conversation about climate change, and then narrow that down into what can you do as a citizen lobbyist, as an engaged citizen here in Wyoming, to tackle the climate crisis. So I do have just a short PowerPoint to set the stage a little bit for that conversation. Is this showing up for you?
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. So I'm Julia Stubel. I live and work in Lander, Wyoming. I work for the Wilderness Society, which is a DC-based organization with staff around the United States. And we work primarily on public lands issues. We do lots of good things. I'm going to skip through this slide very quickly, but we work on conservation of land and water, ensuring equitable access to our public lands and our outdoors areas, and then again on climate change as well. Here in Wyoming, you're probably very deeply familiar with the idea of federal public lands and waters. These are lands and waters that are owned by all Americans, somewhat of a unique system, and are managed by a variety of federal agencies. If you see there in Wyoming, this is why you're probably familiar with it. There's a whole lot of green. Those are our public lands and waters here in Wyoming. Public lands are a part of the climate change problem, and here is why. This might be somewhat of a surprise to you. These are stunning numbers. When you look at the amount of fossil fuels that are produced on US public lands and that are combusted and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, US public lands would be the 5th largest nation contributing emissions in the world. You can see that we're right behind China, United States, India, Russia, and then our public lands, that portion of the US. So they, as a source of fossil fuels, contribute a massive amount of emissions, and that can be an opportunity for us to address. If you take a look at where we are, that green line is the target of decreasing carbon emissions that was set through the Paris Accords. You can see that even through progressive policies from President Obama's era, that we were still not meeting those accords. And then, of course, in the last 4 years, we have a lot of work to undo, where we were going to be even farther away from meeting those projected emissions goals. Here's why those public lands are such major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to talk specifically about the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, here, which are multiple use lands. 90% of them are open to oil and gas development. That agency has historically been highly resistant to the idea of shutting down areas for oil and gas or for coal. You can read in the slide the numbers here, but public lands contribute 42% of the nation's coal supply, 24% of the nation's crude oil, and 13% of the nation's natural gas. So pretty sizable on coal, definitely significant for oil, and enough that matters on natural gas. But the question that might arise then is what else is out there? Gas and oil really come from private land estates in the rest of the US, as well as some state mineral estates as well. And then at the very bottom, when you think just broadly about what kind of energy production comes from BLM lands, very little renewable energy comes off of our nation's public lands at the moment. So why does this matter for Wyoming? Again, probably no surprise. You've lived here for quite a while. You know what we produce and what our state is reliant upon for revenues. It's fossil fuels. Of all the public lands emissions, greenhouse gases that come off public lands, 57% come from Wyoming. So we have an outsized impact on that federal policy about reducing those types of emissions and making sure that we transition economies, reliant states, and workers who are in those fields now. Plenty of other work in other states, but Wyoming has a massive chunk of that pie. So again, our premise is that public lands can be a part of the climate change solution rather than continuing to contribute to the problem. And in our breakout room, I would really love to have a conversation with all of you who want to join about some of the ideas of what we can do here in Wyoming to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions and promote clean energy and do it all wisely and justly and equitably, and making sure that we still have a well-funded government and plenty of jobs and thriving communities. So that is breakout room 2. Thanks for considering joining us. And I'll stop sharing, Anna. Let's see. Here we go.
Awesome. Thanks, Julia.
Yeah, thank you.
So once again, conservation breakout room number 2, and then we'll head on to Tate, and he'll be covering education and breakout room 3.
Awesome. Hey, thank you for having me as well. I wish we could do this in person, as Antonio said, but we will make do. So as we're all aware, the state of Wyoming is currently facing a massive economic decline. The focal point for this discussion and one of this session's biggest topics is that of education and education funding in the state of Wyoming. So up to this point, the legislature has consistently ignored the writing on the wall when it comes to our state's economy, the lack of diversification, low tax revenues, and the decline and or volatility of our state's extraction industries. Julie, I think we should tag team this kind of like this. I think that would work. The approach thus far has been to remove the head to cure the headache, right? However, there is hope that education and the future of our state are not relegated to the pits of despair, so it were. Education is vital to our state, to the well-being and future economic prosperity of our children, and to state and local economies. Education is going to be an essential component of addressing our state's economic crisis, and truthfully, it's going to be the vanguard in moving the state forward. Education is so important to the state that at our state's founding, it was written into our Constitution that education is a constitutional right of every Wyoming citizen. Throughout the years, this value and these statements have been expanded on, mainly through Wyoming Supreme Court cases. The value of education is such that our Wyoming Supreme Court has ruled time and time again that education must be funded before anything else, and that a lack of revenue is not an excuse to underfund education. That education system that we implement in the state of Wyoming, or that our legislature implements in the state of Wyoming through the process of what is known as recalibration, it has to be cost-based and evidence-based. Essentially, that means that we must utilize best practices, and that in implementing those best practices, that system has to be adequate and equitable. Yet another constitutional requirement. The equality state has taken a considerable amount of pride in our education system and the equity that it has created. And truthfully, there is no other system quite like it. We should be very, very proud because of how we fund education in the state, Everything is funded through property taxes, but the way that we do it here in Wyoming does create a substantial amount of equity. That way, those communities who don't have the property value that someplace like Teton County may have still is going to have the same type of education that you would receive regardless of what your property values look like. So while we've taken a considerable amount of pride in the system and the equity that has been created, the legislators' praise of our education system and the equity within our education system seems to unfortunately stop at lip service for them. And education, truthfully, seems to get the door slammed in its face anytime there's a discussion about funding this system. Currently, there are a number of bills that are looking to cut education funding in a continued approach to cure the headache by removing the head. The recalibration bill, House Bill 61, debatably the largest bill that the legislature is going to tackle this session aside from the supplemental budget bill. As it came out of the interim committee, it looked to cut $100 million from education funding. This is on top of the already existing $100 million difference between the evidence-based model that Picus and Auden had provided during the recalibration to our legislature. House Bill 89 also looks to cut education funding by $50 million through a variety of mechanisms, including cutting administrator salaries by 10% across the board, a 50% reduction in funding for student activities, other positions like instructional facilitators, eliminating those, and a variety of other mechanisms. And while we have yet to see what the Senate will do with the recalibration bill or how it's actually going to roll out of the House, there is speculation that the Senate will look to at least double the amount of cuts initially offered in the House, in House Bill 61, if not more. However, thanks to the work and dedication of hundreds of education advocates across the state, the legislature finally seems to be getting the message that such approaches are not supported by the constituents of Wyoming. As of today, we had some good news today. We kept seeing this thing going in a positive direction. The current proposal for cuts to education has gone from $100 million in House Bill 61 to $66 million to $43 million. And then at the end of the day today, as we sit here, a low of $22 million. However, to be real clear, these cuts are still not cost-based or evidence-based. So as information and advocacy go hand in hand, the Wyoming Education Association has been working tirelessly to provide accessible information on the issues of education and education funding in the state of Wyoming. This includes providing accessible information about our state's economy, Wyoming's tax structure, the role of education in the state, and how to effectively advocate for one of our state's greatest resources, our students. During our breakout session, I'm going to be providing a brief overview through our education and advocacy presentation of these topics and provide you with the necessary tools to become an education advocate, as well as answer any pressing questions that you may have about education-related bills, because even though those funding bills are big ones, they are not the only education bills out there. So that's what we're going to be doing during our breakout session.
Awesome. Thanks, Tate. And just another reminder, Tate will be covering education. That'll be in breakout group 3. So if you've made that decision, make sure to rename yourself and add a 3 to your name. And then we have Jan. Take it away with MedX.
Thanks, Anna. And thank you to Equality State Policy Center for hosting this great event tonight. I'm Jan Cartwright. I work with the Wyoming Primary Care Association. We work with the community health centers across the state who really can't turn anyone away if they need health care, regardless of whether they have insurance or even the ability to pay. They receive federal funding to do that work, and we work alongside them to increase access to care. I've been working in support of Medicaid expansion. Sorry, just a second. Okay. Evidently, I haven't talked lately. I've been working in support of Medicaid expansion since the ACA was signed in 2010. And why would that be? Well, in a conservative state like Wyoming, even though at that time it was mandatory to expand to the expansion population, our lawmakers were trying to think of ways to avoid doing that. And then in 2012, when the Supreme Court made Medicaid expansion optional, the work really began. And so we've been working in earnest since 2012 to encourage legislators to accept expansion. One of the first things they did was to write a law that said that the governor, whoever the governor was at the time, couldn't expand on their own, and that the legislature had to be part of that decision. And then it's marched forward. We've had a coalition of workers. We've called ourselves most recently Healthy Wyoming. And this coalition is a group of very talented people. And we work alongside some legislators, and even Governor Mead in his second term was in support of Medicaid expansion. So the expansion population pretty much is really poor adults that don't have children. And so if you're at 138% of the federal poverty level, you're making about $16,000 a year if you're single. That reimbursement in the Medicaid expansion population is higher than the reimbursement for people who are in what's called traditional Medicaid. So the traditional Medicaid reimbursement rate is 50 cents for every 50 cents this federal government spends. In the expansion population, it's 90 cents federal and 10 cents for the state. So you can see that this is really a great deal. When Medicaid expansion began in 2014 to 2016, that rate was 100%. So if Wyoming had expanded then, we would have been able to add a lot of people, about 30,000 people to Medicaid, and give them health insurance at no cost to the state of Wyoming. Well, unfortunately, the clock ticked forward, and in 2015, the rate fell to, 2014 to 2016, it was 100%. It fell to 95% in 17, 94% in 18, 93% in 19, and now we're at 90% in 2020 and beyond. So the good news is that, and so then just to give a look at this, legislators now in this budget crisis that Tate was talking about, legislators now are saying, where are we going to find that 10%? We don't have 10%. And I believe they're looking down the wrong end of the telescope. I think they should be looking at all the money that they would get back. But I do understand that 10% of the budget like that is millions of dollars. The new administration has now made an offer within the new relief package that would be a 5% increase to the FMAP for 2 years. And at the national level, the Center for Budget and Policy Priority estimates this increase would mean $120 million coming to the state of Wyoming. So that would more than offset the 5% that they would have to cover. It would allow them to get off the ground with Medicaid expansion, and they would be able to, run this experiment and see what happens. Unfortunately, a lot of people believe that they know who people are in the Medicaid expansion group, even though we can prove scientifically that about 70% of them work, and many of them work more than one job. Unfortunately, our lawmakers have been known to call them couch sitters. And so it's really hard to overcome that statement when we know that there are people who are working and working really hard, probably working minimum wage jobs. So Wyoming, unfortunately, is one of the last 12 states to expand. And a lot of these states like Texas and Florida may not be at all interested in this new increase in the FMAP. However, I think a state like ours in the budget crisis we're in, hopefully we can get some traction in talking with legislators this year. Without expansion in the meantime, impoverished adults will continue to use the emergency room for the care that they need when it's so dire and personally difficult for them, and when it costs so much more to us and to the hospital system to help them get well again. So I'll leave it there. I really am looking forward to a conversation with folks that come to my session, and I thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jan. And because Zoom is super awesome and always having updates, I'm actually going to build the rooms now, and all of you will have the opportunity to join whatever specific room you want.